right, guys, we're going to pick up again with Wayside School is Falling Down by Louis Sachar, illustrated by Adam Macaulay. So here's our chapter today. It's called Mark Miller. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "I would like you to meet Mark Miller," she said. "He and his family just moved here all the way from Macedonia." Everyone stared at the new kid. He stood at the front of the room. His knees were shaking. He hated having to stand in front of the class. It was as if Mrs. Jules had brought him in for show and tell. He felt like some kind of weirdo. He just wanted to sit at a desk and be like everyone else. But worst of all, his name wasn't Mark Miller. He was Benjamin Nushmut, and he had moved from Hempleton, not Macedonia. But he was too scared to mention that to Mrs. Jules. He was afraid to correct a teacher. "Why don't you tell the class a little bit about yourself, Mark?" suggested Mrs. Jules. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wished he really was Mark Miller. Mark Miller wouldn't be scared, he thought. He'd probably have lots to say. Everyone would like him. Nobody would think Mark Miller was weird. "Well, I guess we better find you a place to sit," said Mrs. Jules. She put him at the empty desk between Todd and Babe. "Hi, Mark," said Todd. "I'm Todd. You'll like Mrs. Jules. She's the nicest teacher in the school." "Todd, no talking," said Mrs. Jules. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "Hi, Mark," said Babe. "I'm Babe Gunn." "Hi," Benjamin said quietly. He decided he'd have to tell Mrs. Jules his real name at recess. He cringed. He didn't know why, but for some reason he had trouble saying his own name. "And what's your name, little boy?" an adult would ask him. "Benjamin Nushmut," he'd answer. "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmut." "Oh, nice to meet you, Benjamin." He never knew what it was that made the person suddenly understand. When the bell rang for recess, everyone charged out of the room. Benjamin slowly walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. Somehow he had to tell her. Mrs. Jules was sorting papers. "Oh, hello, Mark," she said. "How are you enjoying the class so far?" "Fine," said Benjamin. "Good, I'm glad to hear that," said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shrugged, then walked out of the room. If I had told her my name, she would have thought I was weird for not telling her sooner, he realized. He stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. Recess was only 10 minutes long. It didn't seem worth it to go all the way down and then come all the way back up. He didn't have any friends down there anyway. He never had been more unhappy in his whole life. He sat on the top step. "Mark Miller," he said out loud. It was an easy name to say. Mark Miller probably would have made lots of friends by now, he thought. Suddenly, he heard a low rumble. Then the stairs began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. "This whole stupid school is going to fall over," he thought. He put his head between his knees. The rumbling got worse. "I'm going to die and nobody will even know who I am," he worried. The new kid, Mark Miller, the weirdo. But it wasn't an earthquake. It was just all the kids running back up the steps. "Hey, Mark, why are you sitting that way?" asked Dee Dee. "You look funny," said Ron. Benjamin looked up. "How come you weren't at recess?" asked Jason. "We looked everywhere for you." "Couldn't you find the playground?" asked Kelvin. "It's just straight down," said Babe. "You can't miss it." "But don't go down in the basement," warned Sherry. "Whatever you do, don't go in the basement." "We'll go down together at lunch," said Todd. "That way you won't get lost." Benjamin smiled. He was glad everyone seemed to like him, or at least they liked Mark Miller. He wondered if they'd like Benjamin Nushma, too. "The bell has rung," said Mrs. Jewls, standing in the doorway. "Now everyone get inside." She made Todd put a check next to his name on the board for being late. Mrs. Jewls handed a stack of worksheets to Damien and asked him to pass them out to the rest of the class. Benjamin looked at his worksheet. At the top right corner, there was a place to put his name. He didn't know which name to put there, Mark Miller or Benjamin Nushma. He just left it blank and started working on the first problem. Lewis, the yard teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. "Benjamin forgot his lunch," he said. "His mother just brought it." "Who?" said Mrs. Jewls. "Benjamin," said Lewis. "There's no Benjamin in my class," said Mrs. Jewls. "Are you sure?" said Lewis. "It looks like a good lunch." "I know the names of the children in my class," Mrs. Jewls said indignantly. "Well, I'll just leave it here until I figure this out," said Lewis. He left the lunch on Mrs. Jewls' desk and walked out of the room. Benjamin frowned. He looked at the white paper sack on Mrs. Jewls' desk. He couldn't tell Mrs. Jewls his real name now. She'd think he was making it up just to get a free lunch. He wrote Mark Miller on the top of his worksheet. But one of these days he knew he'd have to tell her his real name.